Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to an exciting event brought to you by Discover Economics in partnership with the Cage Research Centre. We're delighted that you're joining us today for a really exciting event with some top panel guests. But a little bit of background first, who are we? What's this project all about? And why are you joining us today? So recently, Cage Research Centre and Discover Economics released a video series. And the whole idea of this video series was to explore why economies of Africa and India are less developed than others, and really look at the importance of economics for understanding history and of economic history for understanding the modern economy that we live in today. So it has been great for Discover Economics to work with Cage, who have really drawn on their world-class expertise in economic history and their global academic network. We've had 5 super videos that have come out over the last few weeks, featuring top economic authors such as Nathan Nunn, James Robinson, Clara Lowes, Stelios Mikolopoulos, and Vishnu, who's one of our guests today. So if you haven't watched those videos yet, do check them out. And we do have supplementary teaching resources alongside. So if you are an economics teacher, you've got resources there, perfect content for your classroom. But importantly, we know that across the UK, 50% of state schools don't have an economics teacher. So that's why we're engaging lots of history teachers as part of this project. It adds a lot of value to your curriculum, but really opens eyes to those young historians in front of you who maybe don't really know what economics is or what economists do. But in fact, they are studying it already. They just didn't really realize. So this project can really open the eyes of those young people and see what next. So I should probably introduce myself before I introduce everyone else. I'm Sam McLaughlin, and I am the campaign manager here at Discover Economics. So Discover Economics is a campaign founded by the Royal Economic Society, and we really have 3 main aims. We want to broaden the appeal of economics to potential students. We want to change those perceptions, as I mentioned, and really attract more students from underrepresented groups. So we bring diversity into the subject, not just diversity in terms of gender, ethnicity, school type, but also diversity of thought, which is so important. So our guests today, we have Vishnu Gupta, who is the research director of Cage and professor of economics at University of Warwick. We have Claudia Ray, who is associate professor and director of studies at undergraduate level at University of Warwick. And we have Noam Yuchtman, who's professor of the managerial economics and strategy at LSE. So we've got some top guests here today. The way this event will work, I'm going to turn to each of our guests who will give a bit of an insight into what they do, or maybe their thoughts on this topic of why isn't the whole world developed? And there will be an opportunity for you to get engaged and share questions. So at the end of the event, there will be a time where we can open the floor to questions. So you'll see the chat box. So please do feel free to get involved in the chat box. Maybe just introduce yourself. If you're a teacher, say which school you're logging in from. It's always great to kind of paint a picture as to where you are in the UK, or maybe even further afield, as we do often attract an international audience. I'll hand over to our first guest. And our first guest is very important in many ways. But one way that she is important is this whole project was her idea. So I'd love to turn to Vishnu Gupta. And Vishnu, if you could kind of, I suppose, share your motivation as to why you thought you wanted to do this. Where did that come from? And yeah, your thoughts and insights on this topic of why isn't the whole world developed? So over to you, Vishnu.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you so much for organizing this. So let me just jump in straight away to your question, why did I start this project? And all those of you who are here today, it's going to take a little bit of time to explain. When decades ago, I was at school and was learning some history, And I learned a lot about the independence movement in India. I also learned something about the English kings and queens. That may be surprising, but we did. But we didn't really know much about what was the effect of colonization on the economy of India until I went to college. And when I was there, we learned quite a lot about, what happened under colonial rule, but I was never really satisfied. So one narrative that that we were told is that India had this really rich textile industry, and that kind of got decimated by British intervention. Otherwise, India could have been an industrial power. There was nothing in terms of evidence or data to support this. So that's what I started to do when I started my research. And I'm going to share a little, I'll share some pictures with you to.
Perfect.
Okay, so these are examples of Indian and British textiles in the 19th century. So on the left-hand side, the red and yellow is a handmade Indian cloth, which was sold widely across the world in the 18th century and in the early 19th century. And on the right-hand side is a British-made cloth, which was produced with machines and sold in Britain. So both are quite beautiful. But to understand why the red and yellow cloth disappeared, it's good to think of what technology was used. And this is what you see. On the left-hand side, you see a hand spinning wheel, which was used in India. And on the right-hand side, you see a machine of the Industrial Revolution. So that kind of indicates that the price of British cloth really was a lot lower than that of Indian cloth. And it is not surprising that Indian cloth was displaced in the world markets by British cloth. So when we look at these numbers and think in terms of economics and economic arguments, we can tell a story that, this is not as straightforward as we think of destruction of the handloom industry. But then the question that I wanted to ask myself is that then what was the role of colonization? And here I'm going to show you a third picture, which is the average income in India and Britain. So the red bars are British incomes and the blue ones are Indian incomes. And you can see nothing much changed in India all through the colonial rule. Whereas in Britain, income began to rise systematically and, overtook India by a long margin. So that's the question I tried to address in the video that I made, to see what are the factors. If it wasn't the destruction of the textiles, what else can actually account for it? And that's why I started thinking about this series. And so that's kind of stage 2. So I asked my son, who went to school here, what did you learn about colonial rule? And he said nothing. And that really shocked me. Like, how come somebody who's gone through the entire school system in Britain didn't know anything about colonization? So at that point, I started thinking about, what can I do in terms of making economic history attractive for school students here. And I went back to the very nice set of papers we have now written by economists, actually, to look at the long-term effect of colonization. And I asked them, would you mind if we used your papers? And if you want to participate, we'll be absolutely thrilled. And they all said yes, without hesitation. So there we have these 4 videos on Africa, on the slave trade, on dividing Africa into different countries, on the European settlement in different parts of the world, which gives us an insight into why the whole world isn't developed. So I guess that was my motivation, Sam, and that's how I started this. And in a way, I felt that economics made me understand the historical context really well. And it made me understand how to look for evidence, how to use data, and how to then, go back to a historical question and try to answer it. So I'm going to stop there.
Brilliant. Thanks for that insight, Vishnu. And yeah, so it's great to hear the journey of our project, but also that kind of thought process that Vishnu had. And yes, hopefully we have those mixed audiences today engaging and maybe getting that better understanding of why these things happened in the history, but also get a better understanding that will help you in your examinations at A-level for history, but also complementing the economics A-level. And as Vishnu mentioned, we are so grateful that these authors let us use their papers, but they got involved and they had so much great fun doing it. So it's one thing having their permission, but if you check out the videos, you can hear directly from the authors who do talk us through the whole research process, the skill set needed, and their hypothesis, what they learned, and maybe what changed as a result. So yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Vishnu. And if people have questions for Vishnu, put them in the chat box and we'll have that opportunity towards the end of this event. Brilliant. Now I'm going to turn to Noam, Alexei. So Noam, could you maybe just give us, an insight into, well, what do you do on this topic? Are there certain bits of research that you've done, and how does this help us understand this question of why the whole world isn't developed? Over to you.
All right, thank you so much. Really nice to be able to talk to young people thinking about getting into economics. And I wanted to start actually by maybe discussing a little bit of how I got into economics and economic history. And I hope that this path may be relevant to some of you who may not have thought of economics as the first discipline for you. I began much more interested in sort of social and political issues growing up. And that was really a reflection of what I experienced at home. So my parents were Israeli immigrants to the United States. And so the news from the Middle East was always on. It was always discussed. And discussed is a polite way to put what happened at the house. There's a lot of loud arguing, and I learned from a young age that if you wanted to talk about historical, political, social issues, that you could bring out sort of moral, qualitative arguments that made it difficult to find sort of common ground. So you'd have, in the case of Israel, people discussing Jewish statelessness after the Holocaust and the injustice of that. And you'd have counter arguments talking about Palestinian statelessness after 1948. And it was impossible to weigh one historical injustice against the other. And as I began to encounter more and more interesting economics research, what I realized was that economists actually engaged with some of these important geopolitical questions, social questions, questions of inequality, questions of history, but in a quantitative way that allowed us as a group, and now I include myself in this group, to bring together data that we can debate and discuss together from the same sort of framework and with shared standards of evidence. And that allows for a sort of debate that can be more moderate and more nuanced than some of the debates that I heard at home. And when I think about, Bishnu's discussion of whether and how colonialism is taught in British schools, having not been to school here, I don't know exactly what the content is, but I could imagine that it is the British Empire and the role of colonialism is probably among the more polarizing topics that one could discuss. And it's a sort of topic, in fact, that I became interested in during graduate school and into my research career. But it's easy to start by just highlighting the different polarizing qualitative perspectives on the British Empire. So on the one hand, the British Empire was a source of certain liberal values. On the other hand, it involved a huge amount of coercion, including slavery. On the other hand, it was an empire that abolished slavery before other empires did, and even before the United States did, as a sort of democratic country for comparison. So you can make arguments on either side. The British Empire as a source of progress, a source of liberalism. The expansion of free trade occurred under the British Empire. On the other hand, it's easy to point to instances of incredibly coercive, oppressive, unequal institutions associated with the empire. And I don't see that much space for persuading people, to be honest, just by making competing qualitative claims. I think that it's equally correct to say that the British Empire supported slavery and coercion and inequality in many ways, and it's also correct to say that the British Empire abolished slavery and as it died out, fought against and eventually played an important role in defeating fascism, which was incredibly important to the expansion of freedom in the 20th century. All of these things are true. And if you take a strong enough stance at either of these poles of the British Empire being terrible or wonderful, it's hard to move people into the middle. Where I think we can really learn about the British Empire and discuss and debate the British Empire is in recasting the question in a way, not in terms of good or bad, but in trying to understand empirically, what did the British Empire look like? How did it shape the world we live in here and elsewhere? And that's what I've tried to do in some of my academic work. So consider, one component of my work and one, I think, very important question, which is how did the empire and the expansion of British naval power overseas, clearly something, that we associate with coercion, how did it contribute to the development of the British state and the rise of a British government that was modern and effective and had the capacity both to engage in violence, but also to do other things that were more productive? Is it the case that Britain developed a modern state and a modern government in a way that was kind of independent of its empire, or did the empire play a key role in funding the development of a British state? Where did the money come from to pay for a modern state? For a long time, the conventional wisdom among historians was that the British state funded itself largely on the basis of taxing domestic goods as the state expanded. So between 1700 and 1800, the British government grew enormously as a revenue extracting organization and in spending. And the revenue that historians had sort of uncovered in driving this growth of the state was revenue that came from taxing domestic goods. And yet, a little bit of historical digging, not just by me and my co-authors, by others as well, revealed that the truth was probably more complicated than that. And some co-authors and I began digging into the historical data in the National Archives, and I'll show you some figures that revealed quite a different story from the conventional wisdom. So if you look here at the share of revenue coming from taxed goods, either from trade or from domestic goods, you can compare two different series. The light gray is the share coming from overseas trade that was the conventional wisdom. And what you can see is that in the light gray lines, over the 18th century, as the British state grew, the share of revenue from trade declined to make up really a minority of revenues. With the new data that we found in the National Archives, in fact, we find a much higher share of revenues coming from trade. And to allow you to visualize this in terms of pounds coming from trade or from domestic goods, this is British government revenue in millions of pounds over time as the British state grew. And you can see the state grew enormously. And getting into the 19th century, this is the British state that was able to defeat Napoleon. So all the lovely statues that we see around London are commemorating this powerful state that emerged. And that powerful state that emerged, you can see, was funded to a large extent by taxing overseas trade. So this role of overseas trade and the empire seems to loom large. And yet, while we write our paper as an attempt to challenge a conventional wisdom and to bring the empire much more to the center of the story regarding the growth of the British state, we can't take an extreme position because the data don't allow us to say everything in the British state is built on empire and these trade routes overseas. In fact, we can put a number on it. We find, based on some assumptions that we make very clear, that something like 54% of the revenue growth over this time period is due to taxing overseas trade. And that 54% is big. It's much bigger than people thought before, but it's not 100%. And so by providing a quantitative argument, we offer, I think, a much more moderate story where we put the empire more in the middle, but without trying to create a polarized discussion at all. As another example, consider the role of coercive labor market institutions. Again, as emotional and polarizing a topic as you can think of, the role of slavery in history, whether in America or Britain. And this is not to say we should ignore the moral and qualitative, but just to say that oftentimes, debates over, slavery and its importance, when purely viewed from a moral perspective, can lead to sort of impasse. And we want to understand the role of slavery, not just qualitatively and morally, which of course, the moral argument against slavery is absolutely clear. But we want to understand quantitatively, how did it shape our society? And how did coercion in general shape British society and the rest of the world? And so, again, the moral arguments can be made on two sides. In the case of Britain, Britain abolished slavery before other empires, before Spain, before the US, before Brazil. On the other hand, people who want to point to the hypocrisy of the British Empire would say, well, Britain imported sugar from Cuba, which relied on slaves. People would point to the use of indentured servants and indentured labor, oftentimes Indians who were forced to remain in service before eventually becoming free throughout the empire. I've studied a different type of intermediate labor market institution between free and forced labor, which was coercion under master and servant laws. So master and servant laws were laws that were applied across the British Empire, which made it illegal for a worker to leave their employer before their contract had expired. This was important for employers because it meant that if a worker wanted to look for another job to get higher wages, that worker could be forced by the law, upon threat of imprisonment or whipping even, to go back to work. And so what did that mean? Well, I have data from Britain, which shows that as the unemployment rate in Britain fell, which is the light gray line, labor markets are becoming tighter. The economy is booming as the unemployment rate falls. This is exactly when workers want to move jobs to get higher wages. And what you see is prosecutions under master and servant laws forcing workers to remain at work begin to spike exactly when the unemployment rate was lowest. This played a role in repressing labor and keeping wages down. And so this is a way of saying, Britain didn't have slavery. Victoria Britain wasn't a society with slavery. Let's be very clear about that. We can acknowledge the movement toward freer institutions in the 19th century in Britain. And yet we can also be nuanced and moderate and acknowledge that British labor market institutions at the same time had a coercive and repressive role against labor. And we can reach, I hope, some sort of common ground on the basis of empirical work that's quantitative and data driven. And so I hope that you can see this opportunity to study provocative questions, the most interesting questions in the social sciences, in an empirically solid and in a way that's a bit less polarizing than you might have feared.
Super, thank you, Noam. So yes, I hope our audience are excited on a few different levels there. I hope teachers are thinking, brilliant, we've got some great data here that we can use in our curriculum, add value to our curriculum, bring it to life. But young people having their eyes opened as to what they could be doing with this skill set. And thanks, Noam, for sharing that journey of, I suppose, where your passion first began. But ultimately, what we're seeing there is this economic history and understanding economic history really helps us understand where we are today, 2023. So all of this gives you that grounding and insight. And I think, works in history classrooms, economics classrooms, UK schools in PSHE, when we're looking at things like British values and we get into these debates, all links in very nicely. So again, thank you very much. Noam. If our audience have questions, again, put them in the chat box and we'll come to those later. I know I've got a few already. I'm going to come to Claudia next. And yeah, I would love for you, Claudia, I suppose, again, introduce yourself, give an insight into what you do. But we've got young people here that are on the edge of making a decision. It could be next year, a couple of years off, and they're thinking, well, what should I do next? Could you maybe give them an insight into what it would look like next? Not just at Warwick, but more generally. Yeah, over to you, Claudia.
Yes, will do. Thank you, Sam, and thank you. It's a great opportunity to talk about what we do as economists, and lovely to be here. So let me first pick up on the thread of empire that both Bishnu and Noam addressed. I want to briefly bring it to a wider perspective, as this was one of the reasons that I got interested in economics in the first place. I was born and raised in Portugal, a country that also had an empire. But unlike Britain, empire did not put Portugal in an advantageous position to develop faster. The Industrial Revolution arrived late, and mass poverty was only reduced in the second half of the 20th century. Portugal's delayed industrialization is still visible today in lower levels of income when comparing it to other Western European countries. If the development process of a country is dependent on empire, then Portugal is clearly an exception. I'm happy to answer any questions about this at the end, but let me now shift gears here. As I understand, as Sam as mentioned before, that many in our audience are at the stage where they will soon make decisions on the path to choose for higher education, and many may not have had economics in high school, whereas others may have. So I was in this exact same position when I was 15, 16 years old. My parents were not economists. In fact, neither of my parents has higher education, so they couldn't really advise me on this. At your age, I thought an economist was really a person that looks at stock markets returns all day and eventually makes decisions on portfolio investments. Today, I understand that that job can indeed be done by an economist that specializes in finance or investment banking. Economics is a much wider discipline that encompasses a variety of fields, each of which analyzes questions of interest, such as why isn't the whole world developed, what we've been talking about today. Which is, a relevant question in the field of economic history. Ultimately, really, economists are people that try to make sense of the problems in the world with the set of tools that they've been trained on. And hopefully those, reasonings, that analysis of data can generate policy recommendations to ameliorate those problems and understand the world a little bit better. So what is it like to study economics at university? I teach the first-year module at the University of Warwick, and I have a sense of the students' transition from high school into higher education. So let me give you some insights on that. Every year, we admit an entering class between 400 and 500 students. Half of them come from the UK and half of them come from the rest of the world. And of course, this varies across different universities, so don't take this as a standard. But in their first year, throughout all universities, students take modules in mathematics, statistics, microeconomics, and macroeconomics. These modules give students the tools that they need to analyze problems of interest, such as the ones we've been discussing today. Here at Warwick, students also have a core module in economic history in the first year, and I teach that module. This module helps them view the world, not just Britain, through the eyes of an economist in training. So the objective is really to understand the world economy and how it got where it is today, and how it has evolved over the past millennium. We quantify long-term changes in the world income and population. And basically, we break down this broad question of why isn't the whole world developed in smaller questions that investigate the forces behind the success of leading economies and the obstacles that hinder the economic progress of lagging economies. We also scrutinize the interaction between rich and poor countries. For instance, we can look at when we look at colonialism in order to assess the degree to which poor countries are poor due to domestic choices or due to foreign influence, such as the case of African underdevelopment, on which you saw a video. So shedding light on past events from an economic perspective often helps us understand and take more informed decisions in the present. For instance, policymakers were better prepared in 2008 when taking measures to soften the effects of the Great Recession than they were in the 1930s when the Great Depression hit the world economy. Although the economic contraction of 2008 was fairly similar in size to that of the 1930s, the recovery was much quicker in 2009, precisely because of the proactive policy measures taken by governments and central banks. I can provide further detail on what we do in this module in terms of regional and time coverage, or also what types of assessments we have, if there is any interest in that. But let me close by saying that economic history gives any economist an understanding of key episodes that shaped human history, including the Neolithic and Industrial revolutions, the demographic transition, and the realities of life under totalitarian or democratic regimes. Over to you, Sam.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So yeah, so hopefully there you get a bit of an insight into how you could go further with this, and you know, how you can take this passion and actually turn it into, you know, further education, higher education, and potentially a career. So I've got some questions that have come through, but I really do encourage people that are joining us today, jotting any questions on the chat box. It'd be super to hear from you, especially in the classrooms. But thanks to a few teachers and students who are super keen and already emailed me direct with a few questions. And I'm going to bring these to the floor. And maybe actually, Claudia, this one might be up your street. So this is from a teacher who I think they've watched the video, which is great to hear. But now they've got students that are in this dilemma. So we just heard from you there of this module that they can do. But what if they don't know whether to go down a pure history route or pure economics routes? You know, we know there's this module, but if they do history, could they still get a bit of economics in there? Or what advice would you give?
Well, it's a tough choice. I love both topics, but now I think there's a few elements that we'd like to consider when choosing a higher education path. So let me just highlight two elements. So one would be what areas students are most comfortable at school. And the second would be what doors will a given degree open to you after you graduate, and do you see yourself in that career path? So the first one is really up to the students' preferences. You know, some people are more comfortable with math, some people like to read widely. It really depends. But for the second topic, I think this is an important question to ask when visiting universities in open days or similar events. So you want a degree that in an area that you like, obviously, but also a degree that gives you the set of skills that will help you to be gainfully employed once you graduate and you go out in the world.
And yes, if you look on the Discover Economics website, you can get further insights into, you know, those career opportunities after an economics degree. And not that we should just be purely motivated by career earnings, but the different types of organizations you could work for in different sectors. So thanks for that, Claudia. I've got another one. So people are putting questions in the chat, but sending them to me that direct. Maybe they're a little bit shy to share them with the masses, but thank you for this question. Vishnu, I'm going to come to you for this one, if you don't mind. So, you know, in recent years in the UK, and I think more widely, we're becoming a bit more aware of our history and our past. And maybe, you know, we've seen actions in recent years, and Noam, you mentioned statues, but sometimes we see statues of people that we once celebrated, and now we feel, should we celebrate that individual? What are your thoughts on this one? Because again, it's history, but what are your thoughts, Bishnu, on our conscience on this one, and how we should be acting moving forwards? And should we now be forgiven for people in previous generations? Sorry, a bit of a tricky one, Vishnu.
Okay. Well, I am fairly outspoken, so I will say what I think. So two things. I feel that there is history which we need to be reminded of every day. And there are things like Auschwitz, where people go just to see the horrors. There are similarly images on or statues which remind us of colonization or slave trade. So I went to Zanzibar, where there's this, you have this place where the slave trade actually took place, and there are statues there which reminds people of this horrible institution. So if we were to get rid of all of them, how would we get reminded on a daily basis for an average person to understand? And I heard this being discussed on television by an academic, saying that, we need this. But having said that, what happened in Bristol on the statue of the slave trader who's glorified as the worthy son of Bristol, I think that I wouldn't be happy with. And I would say that this kind of statue should not be there. If they're there, there should be a label saying what they have done, and kind of be, tell the world that this is the person who made their wealth in slavery. So I feel that, getting rid of everything that the old generation did, maybe 200 years from now, everybody's going to take a similar view on us. So every generation is conditioned by what they face. And I think the future generations have to understand that there was a setting in which this was done or said, good or bad. You can be objective on it, but that's my view.
Thank you, Vishnu. So we must not forget, we must learn. I don't, Claudia, Noam, did you want to add to that, or anything you would like to bring? Oh, no, you're mute.
I'm muted. No, I think Bishnu illustrated the trade-offs. I mean, I think that, a statue reminds us of painful things, the ambiguities in any person. I mean, as an American, Thomas Jefferson looms large as a founding father. And we in general are taught that Thomas Jefferson stood up for freedom and the idea that all men are created equal. And we are taught a bit later that he was an enormous hypocrite and a slave owner. And I think Bishnu's absolutely right that it's super important that we're reminded of these ambiguities, and we don't want to forget. And so I think the tension between reminding us by keeping the statues up and making sure that the ambiguities are present versus in some cases the statues glorifying somebody and just really sending a totally incorrect moral signal. I think that's the tension between keeping these up, and in some cases surely one would want to take some of these down, at least as they're currently presented.
Oh, thank you. And yes, thanks again. That was a super question, and thanks for sharing that one, that particular student. Another question that's come through direct to me, and I think this is from a history student, and I might come back to you on this one. I think they're trying to get their head around, what do we mean when we say an institution? So what is an institution, and then how does one become good or bad? And what I would say to this particular student, have a look at the James Robinson video that we've got on this. But yeah, it's supposed to just stripping it back really to basic details. What is an institution, and how does one become good or bad?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question. I would say we usually, as economists, think of institutions as rules of the game, and the game could be an economic game. And so we think about how people who are economic agents interact, what laws structure their interactions, whether it's contract laws, whether it's a broader set of property rights. We think about institutions in the political game as a particularly important set of institutions that James Robinson has written about, in much of his most influential work. And there, what he's thinking about, again, is a sort of, by game, he means sort of an environment where individuals and organizations are kind of interacting. And in the political space, the rules govern how these individuals and organizations achieve what their objectives are and how they're constrained from pursuing particular objectives. And so again, those sort of rules of the game can be legal. They can be sort of what might traditionally be institutional, in that we have sort of constitutions and political procedure and rules that, again, ultimately sort of have some basis in a combination of formal law and informal norms. And so, a difference, for example, between the US and its history is that much of our constitution and our rules of the political process are very explicit and formal in a set of founding documents like the US Constitution and amendments to it. In Britain, one thing that's interesting for an American is that many of the rules of the political game here are informal, and they come as kind of political traditions carried on from generation to generation. And I think when you talk about how institutions, become good, or, in what cases are institutions good or bad, I think to some extent, good institutions are those sort of difficult to pin down combinations of formal rules and also informal sort of culture and norms that sort of prevent the worst abuses in the case of those with political power. So for presidents, term limits that can remove somebody who's not doing a good job, elections that allow people to have a voice in selecting a new political representative, and so on, and whether those term limits and elections work and are kind of enforced depends on what's written down, as well as on the norms that can sustain what's written down.
Thanks, a brilliant insight there. I think especially for those young people not maybe familiar with some of the terminology that we often use, but yeah. And as mentioned, do have a look at the video series, and the James Robinson one in specific, I think will be super there. So another question that's come in, and I think maybe we'll go back to Bishnu on this one, because you touched on this a bit at the start. So this is a teacher that said the legacy of colonialism isn't on the A-level economics syllabus when they're looking at constraints on development in poor countries. Do we think it should be? I can see lots of nodding heads, but Bishnu, if you'd like to expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, it's such a big part of British history. If that's what you want to learn, that it's important to teach that in the curriculum. So it's about India, it's about Nigeria, it's about Australia, the United States, which was also a British colony. All these things, are important in understanding what Britain is today. Like, it's a multicultural society. Where does it come from? All the countries that were colonized, I come from one of those. I mean, the natural place where you go is your, the country which colonized you. So, and that's created a society which we value. So I think even to understand the present, it's good to understand British history in a very concrete way. Whether we can understand what individual colonies, how they developed, I think that's more difficult to put in a school curriculum in a concrete way, because it depends on individuals' interests. And that may be something that can happen at the university level, that you become interested in the question. And then when you go to university, you get more insights into these particular questions. But, a broad picture like Nathan Nunn's paper on slave trade or Jim Robinson's paper on European settlement give us a broad overview of the impact of this on the rest of the world.
Thank you. And I think, yeah, it's really important, because we want to keep this conversation going. It's not just today's event. So if you do have other thoughts on where we could either add value to existing curriculum or, take forward those conversations to examination boards. Please do share those topics that you think our young people should be looking at, whether in that history classroom or economic classroom. Claudia, what one for you that's come from an A-level student that's, I think, decided economics is maybe the pathway that I want to go down, but they're looking at their skill development. What skills do they need to be successful in this field?
So, excuse me. So at the start, before joining an economics program, I wouldn't necessarily call them skills, but I'd say that liking reading and doing well in mathematics would be very useful if you choose to go down this path. Many of the skills that you will need are actually going to be developed while in higher education. I always tell my students in the very first class that I hope they like history. I like history. I hope I transmit this idea in my classes. But if they don't, and quite a few of them don't, my class is compulsory, so they have to take it. If they don't, I don't care. They are learning a set of skills that will be useful after they graduate when they are looking for a job. For instance, how to write a proper academic essay, how to speak in public, how to distill key elements from a wide variety of readings, how to work with people they don't know, how to organize your thoughts before you're actually able to write or speak. In this module, the excuse that we have is that to learn those skills is economic history. But let's say in 10 years' time, after they graduate, they may no longer remember my name or the name of the module, and they may only have a very general idea of what I taught them, but hopefully they have the skills that they started developing in this module that they will need to succeed in a variety of career pathways.
And I think that's really important to highlight, that the skills you develop, they're highly transferable and they are in demand. Let's talk basic economics, they're in demand. So whether you want to work in research or whether you want to go into the private sector or work in the public sector, your skill set is in demand. So yeah, it's an exciting time to be an economist. So, but we mentioned kind of reading there. I suppose I'll turn to all of you here, but Claudia, you first. What book then? So if a young person watched these videos interested, what book would you recommend?
So I think people should be unafraid of reading widely and should start on topics that they like. Probably a well-reputed economist has worked on these topics already and possibly has written books to a general audience about an issue. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend research papers published in economics journals for a student in high school. But, if these same economists have written to a wider audience and have published books, certainly. For instance, if you're interested in Africa's development, read Nathan Nunn. If you're interested in global poverty, read Abhijit Banerjee. If you're interested in Indian economic history, read Gupta. But I let other people give other thoughts. I have a few names, but others should speak to this too.
Thank you. Noam, for you, maybe thinking back to your teenage years, was there a book for you that you thought, wow, really sparked it?
Yeah. I mean, I remember Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. I think it's still good. It's not easy the first time. I think I probably enjoyed it more the second time. It's very dense, but that one was very much an inspiration for me. I could think about a few others. The work of a historian named William Cronin, which is much more historical and environmental and sort of focused on the natural world. Recently, I've really enjoyed the histories of a guy named David Abulafia, who's written about sort of global history through the context of the seas and humans in relationship with the Mediterranean and then the oceans. And so I'll shut up in a second, but just to say, I think what these books have in common is that they're not written by economists, but they touch on sort of fundamental themes in economics, and so they sort of get so close that they make you want to take the next step and to think about these very same themes and questions as an economist.
Love it. Bishnu, for you, or maybe your children when they were first coming into the subject?
Yeah, so the one book I'm reading actually now, and it's written by an anthropologist, Joe Heinrich, that called The Weirdest People in the World. I think that's brilliant, just to understand where did the European norms of individualism come from, and why is Europe today so different from many other societies of the world? And that's not economics. It's kind of, it's talking to economists and historians and anthropologists, but it's looking at this big social science questions. It's a brilliant book, and it's a kind of bestseller, I think. So I would recommend that one.
So there's lots of action points for teachers and young people after this. We've got videos to watch, we've got lots of books to read, researching university opportunities, but it's an exciting future. So I think, well, first of all, I'd like to massively thank all the guests, but before we let them depart, I would love to get like one top tip, one takeaway tip that our audience could have from you today. So Bishnu, if you're happy to go first, the top tip for a young person set to start this journey.
I would say that these videos we launched are some way to kind of attract people like you to economics, and maybe not even economics, in economic history more broadly. And email us in the Cage office, or Sam at Discover Economics. If you have any questions and you want to know what we do, and we have various events. We actually have a lecture which is going to be on the rise of the Communist Party in China in June by James Kung from Hong Kong. And things, it's events like that which may be of interest to you. So be in touch, get in touch with us. Yeah.
Definitely. Yes, we want to hear from you. Claudia.
I'd just like to reemphasize that, if you like maths and if you like reading widely, you should probably consider choosing economics, which is not necessarily one of the classic programs that you may consider in the first place, but you may do well in it.
Yes, and hopefully we've changed some perceptions over the course of this afternoon. Noam.
Yeah, I would say I'll make mine two parts in a way, but building on Bishnu and Claudia, which is, in a way, economics is really a general social science. It's what Claudia said earlier. It's a toolkit that you can apply to the questions that you're passionate about. So my top tip is to just pursue what interests you, and if it's something in the social world, and you're capable of and interested in developing this economics toolkit, you can apply it to whatever you're interested in. So pursue what you're excited about.
Thank you so much, Noam. And you'll see in the chat box there the contact email addresses. So whether teacher, young person, do get in touch with us. Look at the videos. If you're a teacher, use the supplementary educational resources. And do tell us what you think about them. We would love to do more of these, but tell us the topics that interest you and how else we can help you in your classrooms. I will now launch another poll. So let me just bring that up now. Again, your answers are very much appreciated. So please pop them in there. And when we finish the event, there's a short survey. So there's an opportunity, if you don't want to email us direct, just to share some ideas on what we could be doing next to help your young people, whether in history classrooms or economics classrooms. But overall, I would just say what a pleasure it's been to work on this project with the Cage team led by Bishnu. It's been fascinating as I got to speak to all the authors of the paper, got a bit lost in those conversations because it was just really interesting and really good fun. But lovely videos that have had loads of engagement so far. So do check them out. But let's keep this conversation going. Make sure you are registered for our newsletters. So whenever new things come out, you get it straight to your inbox. And if you haven't seen it already, check out the Young Economist of the Year competition. And if you sat there thinking, well, I'm in a history classroom, it's not for me, it totally is for you. It's for anyone. You don't just have to be in an economics classroom. Get involved in that Young Economist of the Year competition. And we will be having a grand final at KPMG offices. So it'd be lovely to see people that have engaged in this project getting involved there and really helping you on your progression. So maybe one day you'll be sat in that lecture theatre with Claudia and you can tell her, I saw you on that video that time and it really inspired me. But no, thank you very much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you. And we look forward to future events and video projects with Cage. So yes, thank you very much, Bishnu, Claudia, and Noam. Really appreciate your input on this one. Take care, everyone.